Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 172, Showdown. So last week, we left off in 450 AD with two imperial marriages. The first, in the east, between Flavius Marcianus and Aelia Pulcheria, that saw the man we call Marcian elevated to the rank of Augustus. The second, in the west, was between Honoria and the senator Bassus Herculanus, which saw the Western Empire brought to the brink of ruin. But just to the brink of ruin. As we will see today, whatever criticisms and judgments you want to lob at Aetius for being a conniving backstabber or for letting North Africa slip away and hardly lifting a finger, they must be offset at a minimum by his handling of the invasion of Attila the Hun. Aetius, of course, had many positive qualities that already offset those negatives, but even if he didn't, I think the way he managed to hold the line against Attila is enough to balance any scale. Aetius was at his best when the chips were down, and he would be at his absolute best in 451 when it came time to face Attila in battle. The Western Empire was falling, but not yet. Aetius is a big reason why. So as I alluded at the end of the last episode, in 450 AD the court of Valentinian III had a problem, namely, the emperor's older sister, Honoria. Unlike the imperial ladies of the court in Constantinople, who had all taken vows of chastity, a vow, by the way, that Marcian had been forced to respect when he married Aelia Pulcheria, Honoria wanted a bit more out of life. She thus gained a reputation for herself, not unlike the reputation gained once upon a time by the Julias, elder and younger. Honoria managed to remain unmarried for quite a while, but finally her scandals mounted up, and her mother, Galla Placidia, prepared to marry her off to the aforementioned Herculanus, whose sole redeeming quality was an utter lack of ambition. After all, whoever married the sister of the emperor stood a fairly decent chance of becoming emperor himself one day. Just look at Marcian. But Herculanus was dull and predictable, qualities prized by Galla Placidia and despised by Honoria. So, the story goes, in a dramatic fit, she sent a messenger to find the great Attila the Hun and ask him for help, and closed with her note begging to be rescued from the prospect of a boring life with a boring man was one of Honoria's rings, which she perhaps meant to be no more than proof that the note was indeed from the emperor's sister, but which Attila took to be a wedding proposal. At least, that's the way the story goes. Now, whether Attila genuinely misunderstood the message, or intentionally misunderstood the message, is open for debate. Whichever it was, Attila responded by declaring himself ready to marry Honoria, and demanding, let's say, half the Western Empire as a dowry, which was, of course, completely insane. When the imperial court scoffed at this demand, Attila began to prepare an invasion, which was, of course, also completely insane. Why would he mobilize his entire army just to come to the aid of some spoiled princess he had never met? And that's when we start to notice that the farther along we get, the less plausible the I am coming to rescue the princess story gets. Especially since, as those of you who are reading ahead know, Attila doesn't invade Italy after receiving the note from Honoria. No, he skirts the Alps and invades Gaul. Honoria's plea may have made for a convenient pretext, but clearly it wasn't anything more than a pretext. His demand for half the empire as a dowry was only serious in that the inevitable Roman rejection of the offer gave him a further pretext. I mean, hey, I've just been insulted, I have to go teach these swine a lesson. You know, that sort of thing. So what gives? Why was Attila suddenly of the mind to invade the West? As we discussed last week, the West was both poorer in wealth and friendlier to the Huns in disposition. The answer likely lies, first of all, in that general drive to expand that seems to grip any great power. Once you think you're invincible, it follows that the whore, friend, foe, all should bow before you. So it was expansion, for expansion's sake, the manifest destiny of irresistible power. Second was a political hole that had just opened up in Gaul at that moment. The Frankish king Clodio, the one who had been beaten by Aetius a couple years before, keeled over dead in 450, and the question of succession to the Frankish throne was suddenly opened up. Aetius and the Romans backed Clodio's younger son, the one Aetius had taken hostage, and the one Aetius had then subsequently adopted as his own son, following Clodio's death. Attila, on the other hand, backed Clodio's elder son to fill the vacancy, obviously hoping to peel the Franks away from the Romans and draw them into the Hun hegemony. For the first time, ever really, Aetius and Attila were on opposing sides of an issue. Aetius wanted his new adopted son in power to ensure that the Franks remained staunch Roman allies, and Attila was prepared to back with arms the claim of the elder son, who was promising to look east to the Huns rather than south to the Romans. Neither Aetius nor Attila would back down. But the question of Frankish succession was not the only political front Attila was working in the West. He was apparently running some kind of multi-pronged offensive to split everyone from everyone else, probably hoping to create enough chaos that he could just waltz into Gaul unopposed. He sent envoys to Aetius asking for an alliance, because, he announced, he was planning to attack the Goths in Aquitaine, who, after all, have been nothing but a thorn in your side for years. Who would you rather team up with, some untrustworthy Goths squatting on your land, or the mighty Huns, who have always been there when you needed us? But at the same time, Attila was sending envoys to the Goths, essentially making the same argument in reverse. Hey, let's team up and drive the Romans out of Gaul once and for all. You don't like them any more than we do, and together we can be rid of them. Meanwhile, he was sending a mix of threats and overtures to the Franks, trying to leverage them into the Hun camp. Though this all seems very confusing, and it makes it very difficult to discern Attila's true motives, I think the strategy could not be clearer. Sow discontent amongst the armed forces of the West, so that they are unable to form a coalition against the advancing Huns. And in early 451, the Huns began to advance. Aetius, currently down in Italy, recognized the need for a coalition as clearly as Attila recognized the need to prevent one from forming. The bottom line was that if the armed peoples of Gaul did not band together to face this mutual enemy, they were all going to be destroyed. So with Attila sending out his contradictory envoys to everyone, Aetius sent out envoys of his own that simply said, "Don't be stupid, the Romans are not your enemy. The Huns are all our enemy." But with a mix of mixed messages floating around, it was hard to know who was really your friend, who was really your foe, and who was strong enough to make it all irrelevant, and so shouldn't we just join that side and hope for the best deal when the fighting stops. Unfortunately for everyone in Gaul, the seeds of discord sown by Attila were in full bloom by the spring of 451, when the Huns crossed the Rhine River. Source material for the subsequent campaign is sketchy at best, so it's difficult to discern exactly what Attila did to who and when he did it. Everyone has him entering Roman territory along the Middle Rhine, but then it gets a little muddled. Did the Huns really besiege and sack every major city on their way to Orleans? Mainz, Trier, Cologne, all sacked? Maybe, and I wouldn't put it past them after the work they had done in Moesia and Thrace just a few years before. But like I say, it's not at all clear. We can tentatively place Attila in Metz, in northwest Gaul, on April the 7th. And just so you know, I've thrown some maps up on the website to help you work through all of this. And then supposition and guesswork gets him to Orleans in the middle of June. Sources mention the old imperial capital of Trier being sacked along the way, and an old legend has a detachment of Huns arriving at the gates of Paris, only to be turned back by a devout Christian woman named Genevieve, or more properly, Geneviève, who led the inhabitants of the city in a sort of prayer marathon. When the Huns then retreated unexpectedly without so much as firing a shot, everyone called it a miracle. And so Genevieve became Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, or, if you prefer, Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. Whatever the route and whatever the damage done by the Huns, by mid-June they had arrived at Orléans. Orléans was the home of a considerable garrison of Alans, technically allies of Rome, but who knows at this point, because word on the street is that the king of the Alans has made a side deal with Attila to open the gates to the invaders. When Attila arrived, and the inhabitants of the city learned of the deal, they cried massive foul and shut the gates themselves. I can't find any explanation for how the citizens of Orléans managed to fend off the Alan garrison and keep the gates shut for as long as they did, but apparently they managed to hold out just long enough to prevent the city from being taken. There was a light at the end of the tunnel for the people of Orléans, because after 2 months of preparation and negotiation, Aetius was finally ready to make his move. The forces he had been able to muster from amongst the regular Roman army were not nearly enough for him to take on the Huns all by himself. So as I just said, the general had been working furiously to convince every barbarian nation in Gaul, large and small, to join him in an anti-Hun confederation. Initially, the reception to Aetius's plea was muted at best, but it soon became apparent would go the rest of the inhabitants of Gaul. Basically, if Aetius could get the Goths to come fight, then everyone else, Franks, Burgundians, Alans, whoever, would join the fun. But convincing the Goths was proving to be no easy task. The Gothic king, as you'll recall, still Theodoric after all these years, was unimpressed with Aetius's army when the general came knocking in the late spring of 451. There were simply not enough Roman soldiers to make a direct assault on the Huns, even with Goth reinforcements, anything but an incredibly risky bet. Theodoric was not blind to the threat posed by the Huns. He just took a hard look at the situation and determined that it would be better for his people to hole up in their own territory, bunch their forces together, and make a stand at a time and place of their own choosing. But Aetius was not going to take no for an answer, so he dispatched the hugely influential Gallo-Roman senator Avitus to talk to Theodoric and bring the king around. Avitus, you'll remember, was the one who had brokered the peace between the Romans and Goths back in 439, and who would, in just a few years, find himself elevated to the rank of Western Emperor, after the death of Valentinian III broke the imperial court wide open. Avitus had a close relationship with Theodoric, and after much cajoling, he was able to drag the Goths out of Aquitaine and into the field under Aetius's banner. With the Goths on board, other barbarian groups broke the Roman way, and by the time Attila arrived at Orléans, Aetius was leading a confederated army to relieve the city and hopefully drive Attila out of the west. Aetius arrived at the besieged city around June 15, just in time to save the beleaguered inhabitants. Attila had breached a portion of the wall